Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming back to our continuing series where we talk to scholars, reporters, columnists, professors, people in academia, people in activism, people on the left, people on the right. We don't care what your perspective is as long as it's thoughtful. We're trying to bring a variety of different perspectives from thoughtful people to you, the public, so you can do something that I used to do in high school. It was cool back then. Not so cool these days, but we're going to try it anyways. It's called Thinking for Yourself. Maybe we'll have a renaissance, maybe we won't. With us today is Professor Scott Boehm. Am I saying that right?
Boehm or Boehm, either way.
Boehm, Scott Boehm. He's faculty in Romance, Classical Studies, Film Studies, and Global Studies in Arts and Humanities at Michigan State University. Scott Boehm is assistant professor in 20th to 21st century Spanish culture and global studies at Michigan State University, where he teaches courses on Spanish cinema, literature, cultural politics, as well as on issues of global conflict and justice. His book project, Ghosts, Cannibals, and Crime, Spanish Popular Cinema in a Time of Crisis, explores how recent Spanish horror film, thrillers, and noir intersect with the economic, political, institutional crisis reshaping Spain in the 21st century. In 2012, Scott received his PhD in Spanish literature and cultural studies from the literature department of UC San Diego, where he specialized in Spanish cinema. His dissertation, Traumatized Subjects, Horror Film and the Legacy of Mass Extermination in Post-Dictatorship Spain, considers the Spanish horror renaissance of the early 2000s in relation to the cultural trauma and historical memory related to the Spanish Civil War, which we're going to cover today, and Francoist dictatorship. Francoist was the last dictator of Spain. In 2007, Scott helped launch the Spanish Civil War Memory Project. That's how we learned about him. A groundbreaking digital humanities project housed in the Southworth Spanish Civil War collection at UC San Diego, for which he interviewed more than 50 survivors of Francoist repression. 2008, as a fellow of the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley, Scott worked with the Association for the Recovery of Historical Memory in Spain, assisting with mass grave exhumations and conducting archival research. He served as an assistant professor of Spanish Global Studies at Michigan State University. He was also a lecturer at UC San Diego, also lecturer at San Marcos, also research at Spanish Civil War Memory Project. Also teaching assistant again at San Diego and a little bit more at San Diego. He's been teaching at a variety of California universities. Very pleased to have him with us today. We're going to be covering this article, but really only as an introduction to the subject of, are there any parallels between the Spanish Civil War and the level of political polarization we see in America today? This article will be our jumping off port, Spanish Lessons, Reflections on the L-23F and other Spanish coup attempts in the aftermath of the January 6th insurrection. Scott Boehm, Michigan State University. So did we get anything wrong with your introduction or bio?
Not at all. I spent a lot of time in California. I've been in Michigan for a while now. Also, in the interim, spent some time in Texas. And before that, spent a good deal of time living and working in Spain. I'm also a filmmaker as well. So I have a new digital humanities project that's coming out soon that's on basically Spanish politics since the 2008 crisis. And you might have heard of the political party Podemos that came out of that,
Yep.
and some of the city platforms that gained power in 2015. So I think there's some ways that might get woven into this conversation here too.
Probably, yeah. I've heard a lot about Five Star and Podemos. They are unique political animals to Americans. A lot of Americans struggle to understand what they are. It doesn't fit into our understanding of parties. We assume the rest of the world's democracies operate like ours, when ours is kind of unique compared to them. The winner take all, strictly two-party system, I won, screw you sort of system. That's not what most of the world has. So Americans have a difficult time understanding these other concepts, I've noticed. But that's neither here nor there. Let me get into it. You are an expert on the Spanish Civil War. Is that fair?
I'm not a historian. I would say that you could call me an expert precisely because of the work I've done with survivors of Francoist repression, which started during the war, but also continued after that. So I work more in cultural studies, in cinema and film, but also very directly with people who were affected tremendously by the repression that took place when the coup that unleashed the Spanish Civil War began in 1936. So a lot of the work that I did in relation to the Spanish Civil War Memory Project that you mentioned was interviewing family members of the disappeared, and there are over 100,000 for sure. 114,000 is the number that's often cited. It's probably over 130, 150,000 disappeared people during the Spanish Civil War and after, by the hands of Spanish fascists and the Francoist dictatorship. So I worked directly in mass grave exhumations alongside with other volunteers who are helping out the Association for the Recovery of Historical Memory in Spain, and then also our project, which was based at UC San Diego. We would interview family members of the disappeared, and then also I interviewed a large number of ex-political prisoners as well, who were in Francoist prisons from as early as the 30s to as late as the 70s.
And just for everybody watching, so the Spanish Civil War took place roughly in the 1930s. A guy named Franco took over. He became dictator. He died, retired somewhere in the 70s, I think. And they had a relatively peaceful transfer of power back to democracy. I think through the royal family helped out a little bit or something like that. But the Spanish Civil War, for our interest, and it's fair to say, I think that you're an expert compared to the average person. I get it. Professors, for everybody watching, are very specific about what they will say they're an expert in and what they are not. So he's being a proper professor and saying, I'm not technically an expert as you would define it. It's fair to say you are super well versed in comparison to the average person about the Spanish Civil War. We wanted to talk about that. The Spanish Civil War, for everybody watching, was one of the worst civil wars in the last 100 years. I'm sure you can go back to medieval times where it was just god awful. But if you're looking at the modern era, it's hard to find a time where people turned on each other and started ripping each other apart with such viciousness in the last 100 years as the Spanish Civil War. It's its own thing. When you study history, I think you'd have to look at like maybe Rwanda or something to see where just people viciously turned on each other relatively quickly, and it got bad fast. I remember learning historically that the Nazis learned how to be really tough in combat when they did the Blitzkrieg from their years fighting in the Spanish Civil War. A lot of people don't know that. The Nazis weren't ready for tough combat and being brutal. So Hitler sent them down to the Spanish Civil War for a couple of years to get some experience. And then they were really ruthless. He brought them back and invaded France. And so people don't realize a lot of that Nazi Blitzkrieg ruthlessness, they learned from the Spanish Civil War because it was that ruthless itself. You also had the Soviet Union jumping in there a little bit. That's why Russia still has good contacts with Spain. I think the West didn't bother to help the liberals. It was only the Soviet Union a little bit. That's neither here nor there. You live in America now. You have two eyeballs. They work. You're an academic. Tell me, I don't know. Are there any parallels? Is it any parallels reasonable to draw between how people turned on each other so viciously in the Spanish Civil War and how we're seeing people viciously turn on each other in America today? Obviously, yes, we're not at the level of a Spanish Civil War, but there's got to be some parallels at a political or sociological level. Professor, tell us, what conclusions can we draw, and what conclusions would be unfair to make because there's not enough data supporting that? We want to be accurate here. What can we say? What can we not say?
Sure. Well, I think you're right to point out that the moments are different historically. The cultural context, the political context, geographical context are really different.
Totally different.
Yeah.
We understand that.
Yeah. That's important to establish. In the article here that you have up, why don't we start there, since you suggested that, and it's been up on the screen here for a minute. So I'm in my office right now, and I was also in my office at this desk on January 6th, and I watched what happened at the U.S. Capitol right here. And as someone who has lived and worked in Spain, and that's the focus of my academic work, I immediately saw what was happening on the same computer that I'm talking to you on.
Right.
And my mind immediately went to Spain and to the coup, not in the 30s, but the failed coup in 1981. And there were a lot of reasons for that, but the most important one is that visually they were so similar, because in 1981 in Spain, after Franco had died in 1975. That's how he got out of power. It was through death. He died in his bed, which was a great lament on the Spanish left that they could never remove him in any other way. There was a coup in 1981. Basically, that was a coup from the right, and it failed. But it involved a takeover where you had civil guard and like a military police, is the way we would think about it here, and other military officials who were coming in to the Spanish parliament, and it looked very similar to what we were seeing, but much better organized and more backing from the military. Failed quickly, but the images were released after the fact, although in most people's memory, people watched that happening and unfolding live. And it was the power of the image that made these two moments seem really similar. And that circulated on social media. And then also there's an important journalist who works in Spain, who wrote a column for The Guardian that made these comparisons. And the takeaway from it was that coup in Spain in 1981 failed. And it was kind of comical looking back at it. And as you suggested, there was a relatively peaceful transition after the dictatorship. And often that failed coup is held up as the moment when that transition is sealed. And you were right to point out that the king, Juan Carlos I at the time, was credited as helping to bring democracy or to consolidate democracy within Spain at that time. And that's the official narrative of that failed coup. And one of the lessons from that immediately came to mind was that we need to be careful, since January 6th failed, to not learn some of the lessons about what had happened in 1981. Even though that coup failed in 1981, the ways in which it shaped Spanish democracy were incredibly important and powerful. And it really restricted and limited democratic culture within Spain after Franco's death. And that really held until the economic crisis of 2008. And when there were popular uprisings in 2011, which happened before the Occupy movement here. So Occupy starts in the fall of 2011. In May 15th to be precise, in Madrid and then the rest of Spain, something very similar takes place. And it's a denunciation, basically, of what had been Spanish democracy for 40 years after Franco's death. So I immediately started thinking critically about the power of the image to make these sorts of comparative associations that can sometimes give us a false sense of, well, we avoided that disaster just like Spain did in 1981, we're going to be fine in the US. Then I started to think, okay, if it's not the 80s, then there are other failed coups in Spain's history that might be more instructive.
He's for the audience to follow along. What he's getting at, I think, and I'm sure you'll correct me, is, oh, you had that coup and it was a little silly and it failed. Okay, well, the thinking of it's all over and that's behind us is not true. You can have scars, vestiges from trying to get over that thing that last for 30 to 40 more years and affect your democratic system in a way that you wouldn't have had to face if you didn't have the coup. Is that roughly? Okay.
That's roughly exactly.
Roughly.
Exactly. So no, there hasn't been another attempted coup since 1981. There hasn't been a resuscitation of a dictatorship, although the extreme right just did really well in recent elections. But what did happen was, even though it was a failed coup, it had tremendous impact on the shape of Spanish culture and politics for the next 40 years. But with that in mind, I thought, okay, well, there's a pair of other failed coups in the 1930s that might offer us some other lessons here to consider. And so the first and most obvious one that comes to mind is actually the coup that started the Spanish Civil War. So there was a coup on July 17th, 18th, 1936. And it basically failed. And that's why the Spanish Civil War became a civil war and lasted for 2.5 years officially. Although many historians nowadays say that, well, the war actually continued into the 50s unofficially. And we can get into that a little bit. And there you get into demonization and this very divided society that came out of Francoism after the war. But as you mentioned yourself, we're not at that point in the United States. There's great polarization, but we're not, I wouldn't say, on the brink of a civil war in the next few months. But
well, we have a CIA analyst called Barbara Walter who wrote a book called How Civil Wars Start. And she's an analyst for the CIA, and she's saying America is getting really damn close. So I don't want people to think we're out of the danger zone. We have experts saying we're not.
Right. And so when I'm looking at this question in terms of where Spain was in the 30s, I would say, in my view, we're not where Spain was, in June of 1936, a month before that cruise launched. But maybe we were very close to where Spain was in August of 1932.
That's what I'm getting. Yes, right there.
4 years before.
Right there. Because there was a point, folks, where they were still kind of living with each other. And like, maybe I have a problem with you, but I'll still buy bread from you. And my daughter marries your guy. And then I know I don't have the level of details you do. Relatively quickly, it exploded. And they went from I'm mildly offensive to you to I will walk up and shoot you in the face. And just the speed at which you can go from one to the other is, as far as I know, to this day, it's still a historical marker. It's still something historians look at and go, that particular conflict, wow, that got bad fast.
Yeah, I would say if you look at what happened in 1932, which is a coup that not many people even in Spain talk about that much. I learned about it actually for the first time when I was conducting these interviews for the Spanish Civil War Memory Project, people who had lived in the 30s and that I was able to interview. Some of the last survivors, actually, they would mention this. And it was news to me because it's understudied. Of course, the Civil War looms much larger than a failed coup a few years earlier that preceded it. But most of the tensions that led to the coup in 1932 were the same tensions that existed in 1936. They were just much bigger. The polarization got much bigger between those periods. I should say that coups were not unusual in Spain in the century prior. So in the 19th century, there were a number of coups. They actually had a different name in Spain. But it wasn't unusual for the military to step in and say, we don't like what the government's doing, we're going to take over. Also, this goes hand in hand with the fact that Spain didn't have a democratic culture until the Spanish Republic was proclaimed in 1931. Just so a year before this first attempted and failed coup. And that's the period that really we start to see radical changes happening. It's Spain's first democratic period. And you have a very traditional Spanish culture entrenched in a very strict form of Catholicism. And I know you wanted to speak about rural-urban divides that also relied very heavily on a rural base that it had. I'd like to talk about those in terms of geographic divisions a little bit too.
Yeah.
And also had ties to the former and lost Spanish Empire and military culture that supported that for centuries.
Okay.
And so basically what you have once the Second Republic gets elected through city elections, so they elect Republicans. There's various Republican parties that are Democratic parties, and the king who is in power flees, goes into exile, and you have the first democratic period in Spanish history. And it's secular. It very quickly wants to introduce educational reforms, agrarian reforms. These are the two of the biggest pillars of the project. And to create a secular society very quickly. And so they start building thousands of schools across all of Spain and in rural areas where there either were not schools or the only education was offered by the local priest. And your textbook might have been a Bible. That was about it. And so very quickly they ran up against centuries of tradition and a power structure that didn't like that power being threatened directly, and then also being threatened from, like Madrid, the capital, or from the urban areas. So there was a feeling there was an imposition of secularized European, French, German influences coming into the Spanish countryside, for example, and these were seen as outside forces, not native to Spain. And there's where you start to see some of the seeds of the initial polarization and divides that would just get bigger and bigger as the Republic continued.
Thank you. I had heard something roughly about that, but I wanted to confirm with you. I'd heard roughly Spain's mostly rural, a lot of mountainous territory. There's only a few cities. There's only a few pieces of flatland where you could have the big cities. Most of it was there for farming. So you have ethnic Spaniards who are very religious, very tied to the land, very traditional. I'm doing it the way Grandpa did it, and Grandpa going back to the beginning when we kicked the Moors out, right? And then you have these cities where you have a couple, minorities or people, foreigners come and they go to conferences and they spread ideas like socialism and these new kind of European concepts. But if you're a farmer in the countryside, you're not very well educated, and you see these strange concepts to your culture always coming from the cities and always jointly sponsored by foreigners. And you begin to go, well, maybe the cities aren't us. They're them. And then the cities are like, well, we're going to push our power on you. And you're going, oh, well, I was distrustful of you. Now you want to push on me? Well, I'm going to push back.
Yeah. And so I think one thing to keep in mind here is there's a real north-south division here, roughly. So in the north, generally speaking, you have smaller farms, and you have like family farms. This is not in the present, I should say. So right after the war and over the course of the dictatorship, basically during the time of the 30s and Spanish Civil War, about 2/3 of the population lives in rural areas. And it's the reverse at the end of Franco's life and dictatorship. So there's this huge migrant, the Great Migration, basically, that takes place as a result of the war and the dictatorship. But in the 30s, you do have about 2/3 of the population living in rural areas. In the north, generally speaking, again, you have more small farms, family farms, close-knit villages and communities where the church is the center. And again, it's not any church. This is one of the strictest, most traditional, most repressive versions of the Catholic Church on earth. The Inquisition, you may have heard of it. It's not active at this time, but it's still part of the sociological makeup of the church and the communities. And even though most of the north and most of the rural areas in the north are poor or relatively poor, there is a bit of a middle class. There's a bit of economic and certainly cultural and social stability. I have a few caveats, but if you go to the south, things look very different. There you have latifundias, which are more or less plantations, and you have people living as braceros or day laborers, sharecroppers, right? Yeah. Sharecroppers, and then you have absentee landlords.
Yeah.
You have seasonal agricultural work, people living in more or less slave conditions or slave-like conditions, and I don't say that lightly. Absolute abject poverty, and no land of their own to cultivate. And that's a huge difference between the north and the south. So very high levels of repression. I had mentioned the Civil Guard earlier, the Guardia Civil. So they're used as a police force basically to keep the rural poor in the south under control. They want to make sure there's not rebellions, these sorts of things. Okay. Also, people are drafted prior to the 30s. And this is important. But in the 1920s, so the decade before and even earlier, people are being conscripted into Spain's attempt at resuscitating its lost empire in North Africa. The wealthy, they get out of it. They don't have to do it. But often you have the urban working poor and then also the rural poor being conscripted, and they can't really do much about it. So very high levels of repression, very high levels of poverty. The church is also very powerful there, as it is everywhere in Spain, although less in the cities, of course. And so there's a real divide there. And so what happens in terms of support for Franco and for the coup, for the rebels who decide they want to not just replace the government of the Second Republic, but to overthrow the Republic and install something like a military dictatorship or the like. or to restore the monarchy, for example, because there's a lot of loyalty to the monarchy, particularly in the North, more so than in the South at this time. In the South, all of this repression produces political organization. And basically, we're speaking about anarchists who are very powerful in the poor working classes in Barcelona and in Catalonia, in urban centers, not exclusively there, but most strongly organized there, but also in the rural South. Because things were so bleak and because anarchism had taken root in Spain, unlike other European countries and to a larger extent than other countries in the world. And not exclusively anarchism. So, the socialist parties exist, communist parties exist. So there's a lot of mobilization that's happening prior to the war. And the big element that we haven't spoken about, since we wanted to talk about this first, is let me back up for a second. I have referred to the lost empire. So Spain is the first great I'm using that word specifically for a reason I'll get to in a second. Great world empire.
Yeah.
Right. We've heard about 1492.
Yeah.
Right. And then 1898 is when Spain loses that status. So we think about 1898 as the Spanish-American War. Spain loses to the United States, and this is when the United States begins its long 20th century and starts building its own empire and imperial presence across the globe. In fact, Spain had started losing to Cuban uprisings and uprisings in the Philippines already, and then the U.S. stepped in and accelerated that process.
Yeah. It was I think when Turkey was falling around World War I, they called it the sick man of Europe. You fast forward to 1898, and the world was recognizing that Spain was really slipping. They had this empire, but it was really just kind of going on momentum. They really didn't have what it took to maintain it. And America saw opportunity and said, hey, we want to be like the European countries. Why don't we knock one out, take over stuff, and then we can act like we're big and powerful like France and England.
Right. So in that period, right as Spain is slipping, as you say, and before the U.S. steps in, this is important. One thing that Spain does in Cuba is they set up some of the very first concentration camps, which are not to be confused with Nazi extermination camps, because they were not, but they were the first systematic use of concentration camps, which then the Germans paid attention to and used in Southwest Africa, and then, of course, developed and for their own uses within Europe during the Holocaust. So when the U.S. steps in and kicks Spain out of these areas, you have an enormous class of military personnel and officers, and a whole military culture that had existed for centuries, the whole colonial apparatus where people had enjoyed the privileges of those types of positions, status, economic situations, but also power.
Yeah.
And where does that go, right? And so it comes home for a little bit, and then very quickly it goes to North Africa, so present-day Morocco, basically. So Francisco Franco was one of many generals who got his military training in the north of Africa. And this group of military officials who sort of were in this like incubator in North Africa, they were called Africanistas. So Franco's not the only one, but he was very prominent. He was quite famous in the 20s because he wrote a book about his experience there. The Spanish Legion was formed there. And so there's a whole class of these military officers and just regular soldiers who are fighting these colonial wars after they've lost their big empire. For the most part, it's a disaster. And actually in Spain, 1898 was referred to as El Desastre, the disaster of 1898. It's not, nobody knows what the Spanish-American War was. It was called
yeah, I could see. Yeah, that makes sense.
And the disaster kind of continues within North Africa. And then in the 30s, when the Republic steps in, one major thing that they decide to do is to demilitarize Spanish culture to a certain extent. And one of the main ways they do that is by stripping people of their ranks and the swollen ranks of military officials. They start to cut down on them, and this is taken as a great offense, great personal offense, but also a great cultural offense too. And I should also add that in the Constitution, for the 1931 Constitution of the Republic, Spain also gives up armed conflict as a way to resolve conflicts. They don't just ban the military, like Costa Rica does in the 50s. They don't take that step, but they proclaim that, we're an anti-militaristic posture, we could say, which was seen as very anti-Spanish in terms of Spanish tradition by, this military culture that was quite influential and very much tied to the Catholic Church, something that began in 1492, basically. So this is all like too much for a very important sector of society. And so when I teach this, which I do every semester in different courses that I teach, it's almost impossible not to make the connection to when Trump comes in and says he wants to make America great again. Well, that's very much the ethos of what Franco and Los Africanistas were positing. They never said that literally, but it was clear that they were thinking about Spain at the time by 1936, not 1932 exactly, but certainly by 1936, they saw their country, this group of people saw their country as almost an occupied territory that needed to be cleansed. And so they introduced and used many of the techniques that they first developed in Cuba, like concentration camps, and then also different types of military tactics and maneuvers to sort of clear total territories of the enemy in North Africa. They take those first to the south of Spain and do precisely that. And so in 1936, the reason that it happened so fast, as you were describing it before, the level of violence, is because if you think of it as a civil war, it's like, how could, brother against brother, right? That's how it was often portrayed. Families against families, how could that happen so quickly? Like in Rwanda, for example, right?
Right.
But there you have two different groups, right? Hutus and Tutsis, right? So that's it. But in Spain, it's like, how could this happen, right? Well, because by 1936, what you have basically is the African army led by Franco and other generals that were trained in this colonial context for decades coming they were airlifted in from the north of Africa into cities like Seville, and they immediately start to go to work in an extermination campaign to eliminate the urban poor, and then they start a march from Seville up into rural areas, and they try to eliminate the enemy, which is Spanish, but had already been othered and was conceived of as the anti-Spain.
Right. So you have, when we look at Rwanda, they lived together for a long time and then turn on each other. Yeah. You look at Syria, they lived together with a long time and then turn on each other. It's the nature of these people. And they were different ethnicities, and the Spaniards were one ethnicity, but it's still the same story of people who can live together for a century. And then within a relatively short period, a few years, it's just, and I think what you're saying was, so you had a group of disenfranchised military people who came back and felt, hey, we're on the losing end. We had power, we had it good, and we lost. And the way things are going, we're going to be losing more unless we fight back to keep what we've lost.
Right.
And then on the other turn, you have the liberals saying, oh, I know what to do. Let's build all these schools across the country where they've never had in them, and then we can start indoctrinating their children in ideas that we think are good, and everybody should just get along with that and be cool and not have any problems. And when you put those two things together, it kind of pisses a lot of people off very quickly. There is, we had talked earlier about CIA analyst Barbara F. Walter, who talked about how civil wars happen in America. And one of the things that she said was there was two conditions. One was anocracy. You have kind of a dysfunctional democracy. It's sort of a democracy, but people are like, yeah, I vote and I pretend you care, right? I vote, I can vote, but you don't really respond to my interests, and I don't really believe you do either. We just kind of go through the motions. Like the Soviet Union last 5 years before it collapsed. The other major thing was a group who feels they were in power and they're losing and things are only going to get worse for them. And then somebody comes up and says, hey, I can return you back to the good old days. We're losing. We don't have to lose.
Right.
And so
Exactly.
Trump said that. The ISIS group, who was originally Al Qaeda in Iraq, said that to the Sunnis in Iraq, and that's what started the civil war there. They chose not to vote. They were the military class. They were disenfranchised. And I remember the video of this American sergeant telling some woman who was the wife of some high-ranking general, like, sorry, you get nothing. Go home and deal with it. Well, they did.
Yeah.
So we've seen this scenario play out a couple times.
Right.
Please continue, just for the audience.
Right. Yeah. I think here, what's hard for people to understand is how, and there's even, I would say, a lot of mystification about this within Spain itself, due to the transition after Franco's death, in which none of this was analyzed systematically or thoroughly.
Right.
So in Spain, the idea, was basically, people just went crazy for a period of time, and that's not an exaggeration. That's basically was the official line on the war for about 40 years.
But it was actually much more mechanical and methodical. Certain parts, as you're saying, had to be laid in there for this to get to that level.
Right. And one of those was almost a racialization that took place. So you have, this military class who themselves had gone through and reformed through the violence in colonial North Africa, but also represented a lot of the traditional values that people would have in large swaths of Spain, more in rural areas than in urban ones, and certainly within the Catholic Church. So there was a large base of support for that. But so not only the military, but also all of these elements that I'm talking about, they start to see like these anarchists in southern Spain, for example, or your trade unionists within urban centers, groups that start taking direct action. The Republican government itself, when it starts initiating secularization attempts throughout society, particularly schools, the discourse of calling these different groups, and there are many different groups who are often at odds with each other. That's one reason Franco triumphed, because there were so many divisions on the left. But what unified them as a target was the discourse on the right, calling all of these groups Los Rojos, the Reds, right? Even though there were divisions among them, and La Anti-España, the anti-Spain. And so there you have this like demonization that occurs, and also this division between us and them. So us and them thinking, othering, and often it was in racial terms, particularly in the South, and particularly with the poor. And some of that would have to do with the past in Andalus in the South, and something you had alluded to earlier. I don't know that we have a lot of time for that, but in terms of these sorts of divisions, this is how it was produced over a relatively short period of time, but I would say for a period of about 4 or 5 years before the war breaks out.
And we saw similar parallels to Trump. So
right.
They came up with names for the left, own the libs, libtards, etc., especially under Trump, lots of name calling for the other group. And one of them was, those aren't real Americans.
Absolutely.
They hate America, right? That's what the Trump people, those people who aren't us hate America. Therefore, they're not real Americans. Also, we saw the rise of a ethnic identity permanently and in ways we'd never seen before, thoroughly concretized and latched onto the Republican Party identity. So you have like this white identity and party identity. And yeah, it's sort of always been hinted at, but Trump made it official. Like, hey, folks, I'm telling the world we're getting married versus you were kind of dating in the background and people may have had an idea, but they weren't sure what was going to go on. He was like, no, we're doing this now. So I noticed that parallel with what you're saying.
Right. Yeah, I gave a little bit of thought to this urban-rural divide, and there's one other thing I wanted to add. Two things I'd like to add to that to complicate it a little bit.
Please.
And one was really obvious to me because I've been to, I don't know, probably 6 or 7 mass grave exhumation sites within Spain, and they're all in rural areas. And so it's not, and so every small village in Spain has a mass grave or two in its vicinity.
Wow.
So we're talking
Wow.
about one of the countries in the world that has the largest number of disappeared persons and mass graves. So there's Cambodia, there's Guatemala, there's Spain, but Spain isn't talked about very much.
No, I didn't know that at all.
Right. So the word disappeared gets introduced within the Argentinian context.
Right.
And then there's Chile, but the numbers in Spain, dwarf those in
Wow.
Argentina. So there's about 30,000 there, right?
Yeah.
And there's about 100 and at least 114, if not 130 or more thousand in Spain. And so I've been to many very small towns in Spain, in rural areas, and there's a mass grave there. And so it's a mistake to think that everybody who lived in a rural area was, a supporter of the coup. No, there were always, people who were affiliated with one of these, political groups on the left, whether they were anarchists, Republicans, communists, socialists, or they just belonged to a union, or they were organizing, or they showed some kind of support for what the Republic was doing. A lot of teachers were killed also. So I think that's really important. So it's not just like all rural Spain supported Franco.
Yeah, totally. It's
Totally
a complex picture, and there were different variations in different parts of Spain.
Yeah, and then the second thing that I think speaks a little bit more to our present context here in the U.S. is one of the top priorities for the Republic after education, I would say, was to carry out some form of agrarian reform, which was particularly the redistribution of land in the South, so that you would have these, sharecroppers, basically, or day laborers who didn't own any land and were at the mercy, of a power structure that existed, and all these absentee landlords working on these like huge plantation systems. So the idea was to restructure that in order to improve their lives. And then also, that was the main reason, and then also build some loyalty to the Republic and, to the mission, basically, of what the Republic was trying to carry out, which was the democratization of Spanish culture and society and politics, but also to see this in people's daily lives and in various ways of improving it. And one of them was certainly through agrarian reform, and that failed. That effort failed. It was underfunded. It raised a lot of hopes. It was underfunded. The Great Depression didn't help. And there was a lot of entrenched resistance to that effort in, rural areas. People who held power didn't want to lose it. And, we could talk about that for a long time, but I had that in mind when thinking about what has happened in the U.S. over the past, not just a few years and way before Trump, but sort of I would say the large abandonment of rural, America, that I think goes hand in hand with Reagan's administration and ascendancy, and the type of capitalism that he introduces and celebrates, and it's not just union busting, but also I would say the decline of all sorts of services, healthcare, infrastructure.
Right.
Small farmers get decimated. Right. So obviously, I think we think easily, and this is certainly true in Michigan and Detroit, and even here in Lansing, deindustrialization that takes place, and shipping jobs overseas and everything that decimates our industrial sector and affects a working class population that's more urban. But then at the same time, similar things are happening in rural areas that didn't get as much attention. And then things like racism seep in and take root, and there has to be an enemy, right? There has to be a cause for this horrible existence. And I don't think that the left and the Democratic Party in particular, which took a very neoliberal form around the same time in response, it didn't address these issues for a long time. And so you can see this widening, and what we think now in terms of culture wars. They do have a material base, but the Democratic Party, sometime in the 80s or 90s, pretty much abandoned that as part of a platform. giving up on the war of poverty, certainly in rural areas, happened pretty quickly. And I think that that's a pretty important factor for where we are today. And now we're at a point where things are so polarized, the divisions are so great, people are so entrenched, there are real urban-rural divides. I see that here in Michigan really easily. I can just drive 15 minutes north of here, and the signs I see are very different from the ones in East Lansing. Now it's a lot harder to bridge those gaps, but I think it's a task we need to attempt, and I think the Spanish context is useful there to learn from some mistakes there.
So you have noticed, living in Michigan, the rural-urban divide, where you're in the urban area, people kind of seem to think, maybe they're not yelling at each other, hey, vote this way, but there's little cues, coffee shops, the way that people kind of act, the way they dress, they sort of do. And you go to the rural area and it's a different type of lifestyle reflecting a different set of values?
Well, I usually spend time in rural Michigan when I'm camping or driving to one of the lakes. So I don't spend a lot of time there. But yeah, you can see a lot of the Trump or Trumpism signs, and signals as you're in those areas, for sure, of course.
How long have you lived in Michigan?
Off and on since 2014.
Was it happening in 2014? If we travel back to 2014, would you have said, wow, the moment I leave Lansing, damn, those people are really different than the city dwellers?
So what was interesting, what's really interesting about Michigan is Michigan voted for Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary in that cycle, for the 2016 election.
Sure.
And I think there you have a really powerful indication that couldn't have happened only and exclusively, with the youth population and only in cities and stuff. He was speaking a political, he had a political message that resonated very powerfully here, which is it's a complex state that has post-industrial sectors, and still, there's still an automotive industry here. But also a lot of rural agricultural areas, more so than I knew before I moved here. But it's a breadbasket of the Midwest. And you have a lot of areas that voted, twice for Obama, and then ended up voting for Trump. And so once Hillary Clinton got the nomination, I feel like, things swung, and Trumpism took off because there was no counterbalance, at that point.
You did not
play out the same everywhere else, but it did here.
You did not see the level of division you see now in 2014.
No.
It seems to have markedly took off with the election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, you're living in America. You've seen how bad these things can get in other countries. Is there reason to believe that our polarization just calms down in the future? Or is it more likely to believe that it will continually ratchet up?
Well, I will refer to Spain for a second here in my answer.
Yeah, totally.
Because I think we have to be careful when we look at Spain too, because nothing was inevitable. That it wasn't inevitable that the Spanish Civil War was going to happen, and it's something that seems like, in retrospect, there's no way it couldn't have happened, because the levels of polarization were so wide, were so big. The divisions were so wide, the polarization was so high. But that's just simply not the case. The fact that this group decided to take, this very dramatic and very violent action with a great, confidence in the base of support they would have, and did, it just wouldn't have happened without taking that step. And so I was concerned on January 6th, the reasons I mentioned at the beginning of the interview, that we shouldn't get too comfortable, because that didn't succeed.
Right.
The level of organization was obviously, wasn't as coordinated as it might have been. There were certain sectors of the military didn't step in and get involved, those sorts of things. So I think, a lot of us breathed a sigh of relief at those facts. as did I to a certain extent. But I was concerned that we could get a little bit too comfortable, because I think there are too many warning signs that if we don't address them, and there are a lot of things to address, things are not going to naturally get better on their own. So I don't think a civil war is inevitable here in the United States.
Fair.
But I do think that we could be going down that path and could be closer than most people realize if we don't take certain steps to prevent that.
Can we take those steps to prevent more division in America leading to civil war by not having a conversation about the level of political polarization in America? Or is having a conversation about political polarization in America essential to us being able to learn the lessons that we need to avoid things getting worse in the future?
I mean, we're talking, so obviously I'm on the side of conversation about these matters. I don't think conversation alone will solve it. I think we need real different policies
Sure,
that have a large large degree of support, but have not been able to be enacted. And so obviously there's gridlock in Congress that we can't do much about right now ourselves. That's clear. But I think if that kind of gridlock continues and we're not able to enact things that people desperately need, the prospects, are not great for the future.
Sure. Because there was, after Marjorie Taylor Greene made her comment on President's Day that there needs to be a national divorce because the red and blue can't live together. And she was inartful, and there was a lot of data that she missed in her tweet, and a lot of people don't like her, but seems to be there was some sort of discussion there. There were 30 different newspaper articles that came out the month she said that, and they said there's no political division in America, so we don't need to have this conversation. Is that smart, or is that how we get ourselves into more trouble?
I do think it's how we get into more trouble. And what I'm thinking of right now is watching the Democratic Convention during the 2016 election cycle, because that was basically the message that the Democrats offered at that time. It was a long time ago, haven't revisited for a while.
Remind me, what was
my
the message?
impression was, how do we counter Trump's claim that we need to make America great again? And basically the answer of the Democratic Party at that time was, America is great.
I remember that.
We're
already great. That was Hillary's response.
And here are all the ways in which we are great, and we'll display that for you.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't resonate because there are real serious problems. There are very serious problems in urban centers. There are very serious problems in rural areas, and I think like the opiate crisis is a big symptom of that, and there's many others. The list is long, but basically I think, just to get to your point, like, we need to have an investigation of these things. We need to talk about these things, and we need policies that address these things.
That's a brilliant point. I totally forgot about that. The Democrats did, when Trump was going, hey, we have these problems and some of you are being left behind, which was the issue. That's what got a lot of these counties to flip, was they felt they were left behind and no one cared. And he was speaking to them and, telling people who feel like they're left behind, you're not left behind. Everything's great. Shut up.
And that's what happened in Michigan. That's why I mentioned that. So Bernie Sanders won the primary because what Sanders was saying is, no, not everything is great, but I have a different set of answers. My diagnosis is probably different from Trump's, but, there are a couple of points of agreement in terms that everything isn't great. I'm just going to provide very different answers, right? And I'm going to tell you who the enemies are. And these are, it's Wall Street, it's finance, it's levels of inequality that, are approaching, like, if we keep on this track, Roman Empire, statistics.
Most people never say this, but I've been sort of seeing it. Trump in 2016 did what Bill Clinton did when he ran the first time. I feel your pain.
Yeah. I think the difference is I think you're right, and there's a slight difference.
Of course.
I feel your pain, and I'm going to magnify your anger.
Yes. Yeah. Clinton and Trump had very different proposals. Clinton was I feel your pain. We're all Americans, and I'm going to
Mhm.
try to be a president to everybody, even those
Right.
who didn't vote for me.
Right.
Trump did not have that message at all.
And,
Like some of us are on our team, and everybody else ain't on our team, and screw them.
and the audience was different, right? Who was
Yeah.
Clinton speaking to, and who was Trump speaking to?
True. I felt like Clinton was trying to speak to the whole nation, and Trump was trying to speak to a specific demographic that
Yeah.
his team had isolated early on. And so
Yeah.
very different messages.
Yeah.
Let me ask you another question. The January 6th hearings, I'm not going to get into it because it's not the major subject here. We're talking about political polarization, but there have been some people on the left and on the right. AOC actually brought this up too. So it's not just on the right, who said, hey, there were cops opening the gates, and yet we've seen no investigations of the police, and we have absolutely no word about were any of those cops in it. We're supposed to believe that everybody was an honest police officer and they could never be corrupted. And I have family in law enforcement, and I believe that's generally true. But I also know that when you're talking about groups of hundreds of thousands to millions of humans, not all of them are going to be good people. And the idea that, nope, not one police officer in the entire Capitol Guard could ever have been corrupted and ever have believed in Donald Trump is a garbage philosophy that children believe in. And that's the one that we're pushing forward. The other thing I've seen is they briefly mentioned that some of these politicians were leading tours the day before of select locations. I have seen no prosecution of those politicians. I've seen no in-depth discussion. What if it turns out, and I don't know, I don't have the facts. I'm asking you a hypothetical question. What if it turns out that January 6th was not what we saw? It was, in fact, much more organized and much more coordinated and had aspects of law enforcement, managers in law enforcement, and elected officials at the highest level all saying, yep, we're doing this. And what the government decided was, that's too scary. That looks like a real coup. We just won't talk about the politicians and the police, and we'll just say it was just a bunch of drunken yeehaws who went up there. Because if we actually let them know the truth, oh my God, who'd have faith that we're not going to fall apart? Mm-hmm. Wild, crazy theory of mine, or possibly plausible? And if it is, how similar are we to the Spanish Civil War now? Because the comparison we were making was our coup was a bunch of yeehaws and they were much more organized. Right. Okay, well, now throw in the politicians and now throw in the military. How similar are we now, given those factors?
Well, it's still quite different from the 1936 and even 1932, because you basically, and this key essential difference would be that not the entire Spanish military supported, the fascist coup.
Sure.
But a very large percentage of the military did, particularly, higher officials. So the percentage of involvement there, I mean, there's just no comparison. There's none. Now, so I think we should just set that aside. But in terms of it being an issue or a concern for the president and for the United States, I mean, I think we can't ignore the militarization of the police in the United States when it comes to weapon and the influence also, of people who are in the military that are in the police, and like that those cultures, they intermingle and overlap. And then, in terms of, the politicians giving tours the day before, obviously that's concerning, or the weeks leading up to it, it's concerning. I have no idea, because I don't know.
I don't know either. I don't know because they won't let us know. I'm just saying, what if that turned out
that would be concerning? And I think yes, the sort of like the way you described what the images that we saw on January 6th on that day in particular led it to look like, an uncoordinated circus, basically. Obviously, the levels of organization and the levels of violence were higher than what we saw, on our screens that day, myself included. And some of the truth has certainly come out. Has all of it come out? I doubt it. And there, we could also look to the 1981 coup in Spain, where the truth has never come out. And the degrees of organization and the levels of involvement, possibly including the King of Spain, who gets credit as the savior of Spanish democracy, may very well have been involved. And so I think there's plenty of space to, be skeptical about whatever the official account is of January 6th, or in the Spanish case.
Fair. I'll just to simplify it for people who are watching and aren't as educated and aren't as initiative. As somebody who lives in America for the last couple of years, approaching a decade, and as somebody who's familiar with these Spanish coups, is it a lot more concerning that option A, a couple of hillbillies went out there and they had some drinks and they just got riled up with Trump and said, let's just do this right now? Or it was planned for months out and involved elected leaders at the highest levels coordinating with people who were in law enforcement who were deciding that they were not going to do their duty, and they were all in a coordinated attack going to overthrow the government. Which one is a much more scarier prospect to the average person?
Oh, I think the answer to that is clear. I mean, what I would say is that even without knowing those details,
of course,
there's reason to question and to consider those things. But I think, in addition to that, I took the position fairly early on that in the summer before this, Trump was basically himself trying to orchestrate what we would call a soft coup. And I think that was really quite clear and has become pretty evident since then. And, obviously not respecting the election results is a huge piece of it. But there were things that were happening before that, too. And trying to delegitimize those elections before they even happen was part of it. But the way in which, his last Supreme Court justice gets named and the aesthetics of all that, swearing her in at night. I don't know if you remember that, but it was a very, it had very fascist aesthetics, which caught my eye immediately, doing these sorts of things under the cover of night, but also out in the open, on the lawn of the Oval Office. It's quite concerning to me. And, having seen similar types of soft coups, for instance, in Brazil, not long before, it really seemed like he and they, at the highest levels were attempting something of the sort. And so to what degree was he and they, did not get too specific, involved in January 6th? I don't know, but they're not isolated, things. These are things that were operating in tandem to a certain degree.
Did you see Joseph Biden's speech also at night in front of a blood red backdrop with 2 active duty Marines? Most presidents don't give speeches at nights. Most presidents don't have lights that are blood red shining. Most presidents don't have active duty soldiers standing to them while they talk about national security issues. And he said 78 million Americans are essentially enemies of the state. And he did it, and it terrified Republicans, fellow Democrats, and independents, so much so that the next day on TV, his administration hasn't walked that back. Was that a good way to calm us down, or also a sign of polarization?
Well, I think you've answered the question again.
Well, you laugh, yeah. But I have had professors look me in the eye and go, he should have been more hardcore. Is that a good sign for polarization, that when I talk to professors who study polarization and I bring up this speech, they go, good work, Biden, you should do more? Or is that a bad sign?
Yeah, I think Biden's really complicated, because you have that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you have his, ability to strike bipartisan deals, as we've just seen with the debt ceiling and all the stuff that's included in order to get that. So he's like someone who, does that sort of speech, and then also, crosses the aisle to get things done, sort of. So I also think he's a symptom. This is what I would say about Biden. He's done it. I would say his policies have been a mixed bag, largely, but I'd also say he's a symptom of a system that's trying to just keep on without addressing a lot of the structural issues that need to be addressed. And that might postpone some of the worst outcomes, but at the same time, it's like kicking the can down the road. It's also, can be exacerbating them at the same time. It's like we're sort of on some kind of autopilot in some ways.
I don't like Trump. I'm Mexican. My mom's Mexican. She cried for an hour when he was running. So we're never going to be friends. At the same time, I noticed that there was a stance from the left and the mainstream media and in a lot of academics that, it's all the Republicans, it's all Trump.
Mhm.
And I'm like,
Yeah.
okay. And then I had to bring up to 30 different reporters, what about the speech Biden did? Like, they didn't bring that up. And I go, but when we're talking about political division, is this helpful? And I had to remind them. And then the other thing I had to remind them of was AOC said after, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said after Trump ended, let's make a list of everybody he worked for so that we can make sure they're punished for the rest of their life. That's straight out of the Nazi handbook. No one criticized her. No one talks about this. When I bring this up to professors, most of them have never heard of this. Additionally, I bring up people like Maxine Waters from California, where I'm from. She stayed upset. If you see a Trump official, go get up in their face and accost them and harass them. And she was also seen literally pushing a reporter out of the way who was pro-Trump. And no one criticized her either. Don't these things also exacerbate division?
They certainly can. They certainly can. And I would just say on this point, the thing that concerns me more than anything else is that the way in which it became very easy for people on the left to place all of the problems that the country has on Trump. He certainly, in my opinion, made things much worse. He certainly elevated levels of racism and xenophobia in very dangerous ways. Certainly elevated white supremacy in ways that we had not seen in a long time in this country. But it also made it really, really easy to not take a look at how, as I said before, neoliberal democratic policies in the 80s, 90s, and even under Obama continued to produce inequalities, economic inequalities, geographical inequalities, all sorts of divisions within the country. And Democrats have a lot to account for in terms of that. Trump, I do believe, made everything worse. But one of the things he also made worse was the ability for people on the left, or liberals, I would say, in the Democratic Party in particular, not have to seriously take a look at themselves.
And as we talked about, a lack of observation, a lack of reflection does not help the body get healed and doesn't help you solve any problems. It lets them fester.
That's absolutely true.
I heard from a professor, and I'm wondering if you think this is true. He said, look, yeah, of course, Trump made it worse. Of course. But Trump could not have been elected 10 years before. The conditions had to be right for him to swing into office. And basically, things got so bad that when you put him on top, yeah, it falls over. But this idea that everything was fine, and then we put Trump and it collapsed, he goes, no, there was a mound of garbage building up. We didn't want to pay attention. We're like, no, we can, Obama's cool. Things are still working, right? Don't pay attention to these structural problems. Then Trump sits on top of it, and it's too much for the system to handle, and it collapses over. He goes, the Trump phenomenon is because the conditions were ripe. It's not just because of that guy. Yes, he made it worse, but you're acting like he could have popped up out of fertile soil with everything working fine. If the system was working fine, he never would have made it past day one.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, it does. And I think a lot of that, I think it's many of these issues long precede the 2008, economic crisis, Great Recession, Depression, whatever you want to call it. But that certainly also exacerbated these things. And I think what you ended up with in 2016 were two outside voices that were sort of born of that moment in terms of their political potential to resonate with a wide population, and that was Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. And they both offered, different critiques, but resonated with similar populations, and they offered very, very different answers. And obviously, Sanders was smashed by the Democratic Party establishment.
What?
Trump won the election.
So. Bernie Sanders fairly lost. What are you talking? What? Wow. I know there was that Iowa story about the primary there that Bernie Sanders won, and they were using a new voting software invented by staff aides from Hillary and Obama, and it accidentally failed the night of, keeping everybody confused. Buttigieg then, who got appointed by Biden, said, I'm the winner. and that confused the whole thing. So Bernie didn't even get the primary. But I mean, come on, just because former Hillary and Obama staffers wrote the computer program that basically destroyed Bernie's chance of getting a primary, we can't say that the party was in on it. Come on, right?
Even without that.
Okay. All right. Yeah. No. Yeah. Just trying to,
demonized, by the party was not
okay. Last questions.
Okay.
I hope you found that this was a fair interview. This is not gotcha journalism. We may have asked some tough questions, but we didn't try to surprise you or catch you off guard. Do you know anybody who might be interested in having a discussion about political division in America?
Let me think about it. Get back to you. Yeah. Let me think about it. Get back to you.
All right. I'll send you a copy of the video in a few hours. Marjorie Taylor Greene said her statement, "We're too divided. We're too polarized. We have to have a national divorce." In response, 30 different newspapers reprinted a quote from a Utah governor who said, "Oh, Marjorie, we don't need a national divorce. We need marriage counseling."
Yeah.
Not one of those newspapers, 30 of them, defined it, although they reprinted that as a great solution. What does marriage counseling look like for 300 million people who are as polarized as we are, to levels that somewhat appear prescient to the Spanish Civil War levels? Who does that? How does that work?
That's a tough question.
No one bothered to define it. No one.
Well,
all printed. No one defined it.
I'm not sure if this is, I'm not sure accepting Marjorie Taylor Greene's framework is the best answer.
Sure.
The statistics on marriage counseling are not great to begin with.
Well, this was someone in rebutting her.
Two people. I know.
This is somebody going, "You're stupid. We need marriage counseling."
Right.
Who is that person?
Right.
How do they do that? Is it AOC's going to bring all the Republicans together, or Trump's going to bring the Democrat? I mean, is it Biden who said 78 million Americans are enemies of the state? Who does this?
Right. But again, I understand the response, but it's a reactive response to a particular frame that I don't think is very helpful. And so, unfortunately, we can't totally ignore Marjorie Taylor Greene because she has the position that she has, unfortunately. But at the same time, I don't think we need to accept her terms of debate. I think they're distractions. I think we need to focus on the right policies that are going to improve the lives of millions of people in this country. And those policies need to be spoken about. The problems that exist within rural America, for example, as we've been talking about, they need to be discussed as real. And there need to be real policies that are presented to address them. And that goes for a host of other issues across the country and across these divisions that exist, but at the same time might exist more in our mind and in our discourse than need to exist in actuality. It's not to say they're not real, but I think it's a mistake to take the terms of debate from somebody who obviously wants to divide the country and focus on policies that could benefit the large population.
But I remember this guy called Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And he came in 2016 and said people feel like they're being left behind, and they said he's an idiot, and his message won. And he was right, and all the experts were wrong. That also happened with Brexit. That also happened with the 2008 financial housing collapse. We've had a couple things where all the experts got it wrong.
I agree. And I remember a guy named Bernie Sanders who said same stuff, but this offered different solutions. And also, like the Occupy movement, and in Spain, the 15 de May or the May 15th Indignados movement as well, saying the same thing. That's where, you get the political party Podemos out of that. We don't have time to go into that, but there were other actors and other voices that spoke up. Obviously, the odds were stacked against them to have that resonate. One thing I remember, maybe we can end on this because I think it's very important to the point. During the 2016 elections, I was commuting from Houston, Texas to here. So I spent a lot of time in airports. I'd fly back and forth on a weekly basis. And one of my strong memories and impressions from that, so this is during the primary season, is the whole election cycle, the whole 2 years. And what I remember seeing in the Detroit airport, that's my strongest memory, but in the Dallas airport, the Houston airport, Chicago airport, where I was spending a lot of time, who was the person on the screen all the time before he was president? Donald Trump.
Right.
And it didn't matter what, it was usually CNN. That's usually what was in the airports. You know, there were famously, you know, images of the podium where Trump was going to speak while, for example, Bernie Sanders was speaking and it wasn't covered.
I saw that. I saw that.
And that's once, and that gets attention and people remember that. But what I remember is on every Sunday night when I was traveling between Texas and Michigan, people were talking about, or we would see images of, or listen to Donald Trump. So that was good for CNN. They were very clear about that. Very recently, they just did another town hall with him. So, you know, the collusion and relationship between, you know, the political establishment and mass media, you know, and certain politicians and not others is very clear. And you know, so Marjorie Taylor Greene gets a lot of media time now, which doesn't mean that we need to accept her frame, you know, or that we should be giving her that much attention.
Fair. My last question typically is, do you have a thought that you want to leave people with 5 days from now that they can't forget? I think your last thing you said was a pretty good answer. If you want to give a different answer, you're not you, you're not me, you're a random person. You've never met them. You can't even imagine them. They're watching this video. They said, wow, there was a lot of good material. But 5 days from now, they're saying, there was this one thing this professor said, and I can't get it out of my head. What is that?
I do. Yeah, I do. It's not me, but I'll share a quote, and I think it's relevant to our conversation. You know, and particularly relevant, I would say, in terms of demonizing the other side, whoever the other side is for you.
Yes, perfect.
Because I think that's a lot of what you're getting at here. And it's so not everybody might like this, and I'm going to paraphrase, but it's a John Lennon quote, which is basically, if I remember correctly, we're all responsible for what's going on, you know. But I'm paraphrasing, but you know, we all have a role in this, and it's really easy in moments of political polarization to point the finger at the other side, whoever the other side is, and you know, point your finger, you got four staring right back at you. We are all responsible for what's going on, maybe to varying degrees. There are some people who might be more responsible, but we all have a role, which also is empowering because there's also something we can do about it.
That was pretty good. I thought the answer you gave before that was pretty good, but that's also pretty good. Thanks, James, for making some comments out of the comments area. We'll leave it there. Professor, I will email you shortly. And thank you so much for coming out here. I appreciate it. And I hope you felt that this was a fair interview and we didn't try to trick you.
I did not feel tricked. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Awesome.
I enjoyed talking to you.
I will email you shortly. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.